Welcome into a live edition of Locked On Seminoles. I am your host, Brian Smith, ready to bring you some information on my thoughts about the ACC absolutely getting steamrolled by the Noles and Clemson, and all the interesting thoughts that I have on how to spend the money, recruiting, and all that. And most importantly, for those of you that show up in the chat here a little bit, I'm curious to see what everybody thinks about this situation because, quite frankly, there's so much going on, and I don't know how many different guys and gals are going to be following this the way that I do. Obviously, I love this stuff or I wouldn't be involved here. But Florida State football is in a way different position this week than it was last week. And that's a lot of fun for me. I don't know how many of you, again, are really into this the way that I am, but it's a lot of fun. So I want to talk about that next. And today's show is brought to you by Nissan. Nissan is our sponsor, and today's show is brought to you by Nissan's 2025 Armada. Stay with us for the Armada Team of the Week later in the episode. Look, this is a unique scenario. Like I said this earlier this week when the news first broke about Florida State having an opportunity to get in and change the whole dichotomy of what's going on. Because I'm guessing $20 million a year, in case you didn't see it. $20 million a year is what I think is going to be the number. Minimum. Once this starts rolling. And I don't know all the details, the exact date or whatever. But in addition to that, at $75 million in 2030, Florida State can just flat leave the league. So a few of the things that I want to bring up here. And anybody can ask questions in the chat. Please fire away. I know I've got a few of you in there already. But first thing, if you look at the overall perspective of the program, coming off a 2-10 season, you needed some good news. Coaching staff, they really did a good job of going and getting the guys they did. Coach White, Coach Cooper, etc. They got several different good players come in from the transfer portal. In addition to that, and a lot of it came from the staff. So they started doing the things they needed to administratively. So at least got the ball rolling. But getting the ACC settlement done is something that I didn't even think that was on the table, let alone something that was definitive. Not at all. I openly admit I was wrong because I thought it was 3-4 years from now. And from those that I spoke with, they thought so too. I don't know why the settlement happened, but now all the movement that you had with recruiting, the coaching staff, and I'll get into the offseason conditioning comments here in just a minute as well. I mean, Josh Storms talked about it. He had a press conference and he did a good job of answering questions about Daryl Jackson and Thomas Castellanos and several other people. This was a really unique scenario for all this just to happen just on top of each other right before spring ball. It is a phenomenal timing for Florida State. That's something I should have touched on in my shows earlier this week. You're getting ready to kick off spring ball and be ready for the next season. And then you get right before, when there's truly not much news, you get the ball dropped right in your lap. Hey, you guys are also going to be done with this. You don't have to worry about the lawsuit anymore. You got money coming in. So real quick, here are the numbers overall. 40% is still going to be based from the TV revenue like it always was. But more importantly, 60% is not. It's going to be based on eyeballs. And from 2014 through 2022, Florida State was the number one TV viewership program in the Atlantic Coast Conference. Number 2 was Clemson. They were like 3.08. And Miami was third, a distant third at 2.04. I mean, Miami did okay, but they're still way behind the other two schools. They're making the same money. Duke was 1.02. Like Florida State literally got 3 times plus more eyeballs than Duke football, yet they were getting paid the same. So that's garbage. Florida State did what they needed to get the money, and now they can benefit. A few of the things that I touched on earlier this week right here is the key. Retention for coaches, administration, better facilities, having the ability to buy out a coach, add a coach to your roster or your back office in addition to what you have. When somebody gets poached, you can go you have so much more money to do those things. It's better. And from a recruiting perspective, because I love talking about recruiting, there is no way in the world I do not expect Florida State's back office staff not to increase. Matter of fact, I think it will be massively different very, very soon. I expect to see Florida State staff grow by 2 or 3 people. If they want to go that route, they can go 10, go with a lot of different people that are younger, maybe not as experienced, but I'm guessing they're going to go more high end because there's a growing trend to talk about GMs and people with NFL experience. I think Florida State will go that route and have other people that have experience at the collegiate and National Football League level. The money they're spending is great. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And again, any questions you have, fire away in the chat. But I'm curious to what everybody really thinks is going to happen, because honestly, I don't think there's any definitive, like the first person in here that just asked, Umad Push Square, says, which conference are we going to? That's a great question, and I'd love to know that as well. My first take on the conference situation, brother, is very simple. And again, anybody wants to comment, fire away. Florida State is going to end up in the SEC or the Big Ten at some point, because just about everybody is. That being the case, the next 5 to 8 years, there's a lot of flux. My guess on why the ACC folded their hand when it seemed like they had, well, at least appeared, the upper hand and had the advantage because of the grant of rights, is because ESPN/ABC/ the parent company Disney doesn't want to tick off all the powers that be for the long term. They took the short-term loss for their potential, at least, long-term gain. And Florida State and Clemson are the beneficiaries. If you make them mad and they go into the Big Ten or whatever, they're going to be the fly in the ointment and other things down the road. If I had to guess right now, I would say Big Ten for Florida State, because Miami and Florida, both of them don't want Florida State being in the SEC. I can guarantee you that. And Florida in particular, they don't want Florida State to have that same kind of recruiting cachet. Big Ten's not much different, though. In the Big Ten, here's the key. They want to have a footprint in the state of Florida. They want to pretty much be the national conference. Fair enough. I can understand that. So the money's pretty similar between the Big Ten and SEC. It's 6 one way, half dozen the other. But I believe that the Big Ten's slightly bigger right now, but they go back and forth. It'll be very, very similar. So my guess is Florida State ends up in the Big Ten long term. There's a lot of reasons why I think that could be good and some that could be bad. We can get into that here in just a minute. Jerry, what's going on, brother? I'm not a conspiracy person, but probably ESPN and Fox played a role in some capacity in the settlement. Jerry, you and I are on the exact same page. I agree. I believe that the networks, whether we want to hear it or not, are the primary reason that Florida State, Clemson, and let's be honest, it sounds like North Carolina wants out too, are still going to be in the league at least short term with more money to see. I'm guessing the ACC knows its goose is cooked. They want to milk this as long as they can. Some of these executives are going to try to get a parachute out of town with a lot of money. We'll see how that goes. But again, Jerry, he says, I am not a conspiracy person, but probably ESPN and Fox played a role in some capacity in this settlement. I could not agree more. One other point to touch upon here, I'm guessing that a lot of these people were just tired of dealing with it. I mean, could you imagine dealing with these kinds of questions and comments and everybody around, asking your family about it for 3-4 more years? That would get really annoying. All parties involved probably were ready to move forward. Now, you still got to make the litigation work, which they did, but it's pretty interesting. All right, let's see what we got here. Garrett, what's going on, brother? Does this seem like the best case scenario? We can build up our roster with more money, compete for the ACC title each year. Then in theory, we could have a roster to compete against Big Ten and Southeastern Conference. To be honest, that's one of the things that it's kind of hard to see it not being that way. Like, I think Garrett hit this on the head again, just like Jerry did with the last comment. Florida State's roster is nowhere near where it needs to be. It's not. It's not where it needs to be. But at the same time, Florida State is in a scenario where it's gotten a lot better. Just in this offseason, it's got better. With improved finances, you can sell the following points. I'll bring this up before we go in first break. You can sell all the different advantages for facilities, which they'd already done, but moving forward, we'll have more of them. We will have more staff. We will have more trainers. We will have more in regards to all our strength and conditioning with nutrition combined in. All the little things. If you got $20 million more, give or take a year, it's not hard to add into what you need. And this will also, just for the record, this isn't just about football. Florida State's women's athletic department or women's side of the athletic department, they're going to benefit. So will every sport at Florida State, because when Florida State football wins, the coffers overflow, and then that helps each and every other program. That's how this works at Georgia, Texas, Southern Cal, Notre Dame, any other school as well. Florida State will benefit quite a bit from this. And to be honest with you, I'm all here for it, because I can tell you firsthand, it wasn't real fun covering Florida State in a lot of regards last year, because let's be really honest, 2-10 ain't much fun each and every day to talk about. So I'm all for it. When we come back, we're going to continue on with the discussion about Florida State and the ACC, get into some recruiting stuff, and any questions we have, I will read them off as well. The Armada Team of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 25 Nissan Armada. Each week, our Locked On College basketball experts are picking one team that stands apart. From top-seeded stars to the unexpected upsets, these guys showcase the strength and sheer power needed to push their team forward. This week's Armada and Clear-Cut Team of the Week are the Houston Cougars. Since joining the Big 12 last season, the Cougars have gone a combined 33-4 in conference games, winning the regular season title by multiple games both years. There is no team in college basketball that more capably embodies the rugged Armada than Kelvin Sampson's squad. Houston's tenacious defense leads the nation in fewest points allowed per game for the second straight season. When it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what the Houston Cougars have done. It's clear that our Team of the Week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of the Nissan's outstanding vehicles. Take the Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. All right, I'll go back in here to the chat, kind of continue on. Garrett, I feel like if we let the ACC right now for the Big Two, we might be a tomato can for the big-time programs. I don't know if Florida State would just completely get just run over. It's possible. Like Ohio State's going to beat the crap out of most teams most years. But here's a little basic point. With the bargaining that's coming up, and I'll get more into this later this month, but maybe even next week. April 7th, the House is going to have their vote or try to finalize the deal on all the money that's going to go for NIL, etc. The House settlement, they call it. But everybody knows that's not going to start till July 1st. So the money they normally have for a full calendar year, they're going to spend in months from January through the end of June. So like this year, you can load up and maybe go and make another run at somebody in the spring portal. It's a 10-day window in late April. Possibly, Florida State could be in a scenario where they add to their roster. Maybe they surprise some teams this year. For the record, I'm picking Florida State to go 7-5. Is that a great team? No, but I think they'll be vastly improved. You went and got not one, not two, not three, but 4 offensive linemen out of the portal with starting experience. That's pretty important, including Pettis, who I think will be one of the more dominant run blockers in college football. He's going to be your right tackle. That matters. Florida State should be far, far better up front, and we all know that the O-line was the biggest problem for the Florida State Seminoles in 2024, probably not even close with the second place for that. So that alone should give them more opportunity. And while the schedule is not easy per se, they don't play Notre Dame this year. That certainly helps. And they have Miami coming back up north to Doak. So I look at this in a different way than other people do. I don't know which games they're going to win. There are probably going to be some ups and downs. But if Florida State was in the Big Ten, would they be great? Part of it's got to get a little luck with the draw. But they're not going to just be easily beaten either. Castellanos fits the offense. I believe that they have a good offensive line. And I also think that the skill positions on offense were much better last year than what we saw. But quarterbacks didn't have any faith in what was happening in front of them. And they just got murdered. They were looking down instead of looking at the routes because they were ready to get hit. They didn't want to, but they knew they probably were going to in about 2.5 seconds. That does not lead to success. So I digress. But anyway, great point by Garrett, though. Florida State, to sustain consistency at the Big Ten or the SEC level, they need more depth, especially O-line. Again, we know that. Receiver just needs some top-end guys. I think Deuce will make a big difference there. On defense, the secondary is the one spot I feel better about. Linebackers on the tipping point. We need to stay healthy here to see that go the right direction. And D-line is a little bit better than what I expected it to be at this point because of the transfer portal, but they need to be able to get to high school kids. And we're going to talk more about that here pretty soon. Next up here, we got Florida Man says, SEC or Big Ten? Where are we going? I just talked about that a few minutes ago, my friend. If I had to pick, and this is just my own perspective, I would say Florida State ends up in the Big Ten. I don't think Florida wants Florida State in the SEC, and I know the Big Ten wants a footprint in the state of Florida. The SEC is not as concerned about branching out nationally like the Big Ten is. I think the Big Ten will pay more. Maybe there's some kind of sweeten the deal kind of scenario. Here's what I mean by that. Florida State might get, and whoever comes with them, maybe it's Carolina, maybe it's Clemson, maybe it's NC State. I don't know how that'll work, but we'll see later. They might get some kind of bonus for coming into the league, which would quote unquote help offset the exit fee from the grant of rights. Let's assume 2030. It's $75 million at the end of that season. Still not a cheap number by any means. So maybe the Big Ten says you get an extra 10% bonus over the first 6 years, something like that, to help offset at least a little of that, and an extra 15 million or 20 million or something for joining. I don't know, but there are different ways you can calculate it. That's stuff that needs to be taken care of behind closed doors. So whichever one would be more likely, and there's so many different scenarios here, we'll see what happens, that I think Florida State just needs to play their hand accordingly, do their due diligence, and not rush into anything. Here's the real wild card, North Carolina. North Carolina, because of Belichick being there, obviously they've got NIL now, allegedly. We'll see how much they spend. They allegedly have some boosters that are wanting to get involved. They could be more attractive to the Big Ten, because I come from Big Ten country. I can tell you they would love to have North Carolina brand in the Big Ten basketball conference. Like, that'd be great. Playing at Indiana and Ohio State, playing games in Champaign and Ann Arbor, they would love that. So maybe there's a way you can get multiple, and then that would help sweeten the pot. Instead of getting 10%, maybe the first 2 years they get an extra 20%. So I don't know. Depends on what they can do in combination just as much as what they can do in terms of right now. They got to look at this from a long-term perspective. You don't just grab a team and say, we want your brand for the next 3 years, then we're going to move on. They would like to have Florida State for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That's the objective here. You want continuity within your conference. You want top name brands, and you want the kind of, well, not just kind of, but you want the elite name brands that bring TV eyeballs. Florida State's the number one school in the ACC for football when it comes to eyeballs. That's proven. I think they will command more on the market than people think, and at least make the SEC consider it. Does that mean it's perfect? Not necessarily. But I also think that there's a lot of opportunity to look at this from a perspective of why would we not at least consider it? Talking about the SEC. Again, I think the Big Ten's the leader in the clubhouse, but slow. I don't think that's a lock. The Big Ten, though, again, they want to have a footprint in the state of Florida. That's really important. If you don't want to do that, then Florida State's not an option. We've never heard about the SEC saying that because they already got one. UF is in Gainesville. It's not like it's very hard. So looking at this overall, I think you're talking about a scenario where Florida State probably has the lean towards the Big Ten. I would say 55-45. And to kind of wrap up that discussion and move on to a little recruiting and kind of go from there, let's see what the next 6 months brings. I would wager that there's going to be some kind of news, Pat Forty or some, I don't know who it'll be. It's going to announce something. Maybe it's Bud Elliott, whatever. Somebody's going to announce something. Hey, they're at least talking to and fill in the blank. And here's why. All of this is backed backdoor conjecture until it's not. Like that stuff that happened earlier this week, I mean, I'm sure a few people knew about maybe Gene Williams or something, but not a whole lot because it's lawyer stuff. It's about legal documents and getting signed. That stuff, it's different than like a verbal commitment that I find out about 2-3 weeks ahead of time. That's a whole different animal, man. So anyway, moving on from the ACC deal that Florida State did tremendous at, which, by the way, is well-deserved. Just want to touch on a couple of things from Josh Storms, his press conference. And I know several people have written about this. You can check some of this online too, but I just want to give some highlights. He was talking about how guys have become leaders, talked about Castellanos, Daryl Jackson, etc. And really interesting point about Daryl Jackson. This is so true in sport. It's one thing to work out hard. It is another to work out hard and push your teammates and friends to do the same. It can be awkward. It can be really awkward. Nobody's going to tell me Daryl Jackson was a leader last year because he couldn't lead himself. There were too many times he was loafing, and I talked about it right here on Locked on Seminoles. He did not do his due diligence in terms of take care of himself, let alone his teammates, at least all the time. And he's got a world of talent. So Florida State has ponied up to keep him there. Now he's supposedly, again, from what Josh Storm said, is kind of a leader. That defense is going to go through a humongous change with all the terminology, the scheme. Like it's completely different in the front seven. It's a massive undertaking what they're doing. There's no shortcut. There's going to be mental errors galore. So if you don't have a bunch of leaders, especially you need some that are from the core, meaning the team from last year, it becomes really hard. So this is one of the most important things in the offseason because Daryl, like, he's the guy that you want first off the bus on a road trip to NC State or Miami or wherever. That's a dude. So having his leadership is important. Second, you got to have a guy on the offensive side, and no matter where they're from, quarterback's important. I know Thomas Castellanos. He's a good guy, extremely hard worker, and he's a very freakish athlete. I'm glad to hear that he's doing well too. Now, there are guys that are freshmen and some transfers that are doing well and all that stuff. But if Florida State's even going to make it to 7-5, and in case you missed it, that's my prediction for next year, Thomas Castellanos has got to do more than run around and make some crazy plays. Installing the offense, holding people accountable to be on time to meetings, holding people to be accountable to be at lifts, holding people to be accountable to not be idiots in their off time, going out and getting drunk and getting high and stupid stuff. A lot of college football players do that crap. If you're doing that, you're not winning games. Be accountable. Now, I expected Castellanos to be a leader because I've known him, but I didn't know it would happen right away. For him to get mentioned quickly, it's not only that he's doing the leadership things, it's also, this is so important, it's also that it's being received well. He's the new guy. Like Daryl, at least he's coming back to Florida State. He's been in FSU a couple of years. That's different. It's a whole nother ball game for Thomas Castellanos because he's the new guy in the clubhouse. Florida State is fortunate to have him. He fits Gus's offense. He's a good guy. He'll be a senior. All those things are great. But if he was not well received, this next season would go in the toilet in a hurry. The quarterback cannot be the unpopular guy in the locker room. It just can't happen. I don't care if you're a run-first offense that doesn't throw much or anything. It cannot happen. So Florida State's in a pretty good spot there. As for recruiting, I just want to mention a couple of things here that are kind of interesting to me, and I've touched on these this week. But Florida State is ahead of where I thought they would be, and I talked about Jordan Campbell. I didn't think they had a shot in the world at signing him. He's out of Carroll City, down in Miami, public league school kid. Been committed to Miami for about 2 years, give or take. Florida State's all over him. Defense coordinator, Mike Norvell, linebacker coach, secondary, Tim Harris. They are putting an effort across the board. I'm just using Jordan Campbell as an example because I interviewed him this past Sunday at Under Armour Miami. Great guy, very respectable. I wish him all the best no matter where he goes. But he's one of those guys you walk up to and you're like, that's what it's supposed to look like. He looks like a Florida State linebacker circa 1998. He looks like a guy that's all ACC and possibly an All-American. He's still in high school. Florida State has to get more of these kinds of guys. And they're putting in the due diligence. And I'll just be blunt. The last year or so prior to that, it was so random with Florida State's coaching staff in terms of recruiting. I didn't know what they were going to get in regards to this next staff because I didn't know how much Norvell was going to prioritize it. But again, Coach Coop, Coach Harris, Coach Hand, Gus, everybody's had a part in making this better, and they blended in with the staff to make recruiting better. And again, I'm using Jordan Campbell as one example. They're a bunch, but they're Chauncey Cannon. I'll just use him to kind of wrap up the recruiting point here. He might be the best corner in the country, and he's got a connection. Somebody in his family, I think it's his sister's at Florida State or went to Florida State, whatever it is. But he really likes the Noles. But like every other kid I've heard about, and this I don't blame them for this. I'd probably think they're nuts if they didn't. They want to see Florida State this spring. And they also, here's a big one, they want to see Florida State this fall. Do you blame them? They're coming off 2-10. I mean, why would you blame them? Florida State's competing with Georgia and Florida and all these schools. Right now, it looks like Florida State and Georgia are probably the top two, but it changes a little bit. But I've also been told by somebody that knows more about it than I do. I certainly do not know Chauncey. I don't think I've ever met him. Florida State's going to win out if they have a good season this fall, and they're consistent with recruiting him. Like, he wants to go to Florida State, but they got to earn it. I get it. He's got a possible NFL future. There aren't a lot of corners like Chauncey Cannon. For those that don't know, he plays at Booker High School in Sarasota. It's a pretty good program. They got a lot of players there right now. They goes in cycles with public schools around the state. Right now, Booker is up. They got some ball players. But Chauncey Cannon is a guy that's a national top 100 recruit by everybody, pretty much. And he's a kid that if you get him, it helps you change the narrative in the state of Florida. Because Florida State has lost way too many of the big battles. They still get plenty of kids from Florida, don't get me wrong. But they haven't won enough of the elite recruiting battles. And to be honest, on top of that, Georgia's been one of the main culprits. Beating Georgia for a kid is important, whether it's a kid in Georgia, whether it's a kid in Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, I don't care where it's at. That is good recruiting cachet. And it's also a corner. Like, that's a premier position. Florida State, that's the one spot on the roster. I said this a number of times. They're in a pretty good spot there. But you want to continue that. If you're going to go into the Big Ten in a few years, etc., you've got to get kids like Chauncey Cannon. You've got to get kids like that every single year, especially when they've got, again, a tie to your school. Chauncey does. So I think that Florida State's in a little better spot with recruiting than what I had anticipated at this point. But now they got to go through and earn it. They got a bazillion kids lined up for visits. But here's the kicker. And again, I don't blame them for this. Every kid that is committed in the Noles right now that has set in a visit with the Noles also has at least one visit set somewhere else. Nobody is 100% convinced that this staff is here long term. They shouldn't be. They won 2 freaking games. One of my buddies pointed that out to me the other day. I'm like, oh, that's a good point. Do you blame them? No. As we kind of close up here, and I'll read a few more things from the chat and make a few more comments. Florida State is ahead of schedule, but you got to remember where they were. I mean, the bar is really low. This next season, I expect them to be competitive in every game. Things are certainly trending in the right direction, and I cannot state enough how important it was to not only get the ACC thing out of the way, but I mean, they kicked the crap out of the ACC in the deal. And again, so did Clemson. And they've opened up the gate to end. Again, if I had to pick, it would be the Big Ten down the road in 2030. That's great. But you need to build your roster now. Recruit well, because the kids in 26, some of those kids will be like fifth-year seniors the first year you go to the Big Ten. You want to go into the Big Ten without experienced, talented players? How well is that going to go? Not very good. You need to recruit really well now. The 26, 7, and 8 classes are paramount for Florida State's success in the Big Ten, or if it is the SEC. Because if you start out really slow in either one of those leagues, recruiting will take a massive hit at that point. And you could be the middle of the pack kind of team, be a 7-5 program real quick. They must recruit at an elite level now. That means the finances they're going to get from this new deal in the ACC, everything they're setting up, Florida State has to make every opportunity work out and maximize. Administratively, recruiting staff, when a coach leaves or somebody in the back office, whoever they replace, all of that stuff, it has to mesh. And that's the way it is in general. But the Big Ten, again, that's my pick. If that's the conference, you're going to travel more. It's going to be harder. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Oregon, USC, Washington, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Illinois is pretty good around. Indiana won 11 games last year. That league is no joke. It's way better than the ACC. That's the obvious. Florida State better be ready with all the things in the back office and have all their I's dotted, all their T's crossed, and ready to go. We'll see what happens because, it may not work out for Norvell. They may have to spend a bundle of money. I don't know. Maybe they do okay this year because Castellanos is there, but it doesn't work out the next year. $30-40 million just to get him out. That doesn't count the other staff. Like this money that they got coming from the ACC, it matters so much. So good for Florida State for getting that done. And hats off to everybody that was involved with that. I'm sure that was excruciating too, because that there's nobody that's going to tell me that was fun. It's got to be pretty awful. Garrett says, why was the last staff allowed to be so lax with the recruiting last year, or were they just not good at it? You know what? That's something I've tried to figure out, Garrett. That is a tremendous question. Like I'll correct you and add on to this, though. You said last year. Here's a real simple point. First year in, when you're taking over, like that first at the end of the cycle or whatever, that's one thing. Norvell hadn't had a top 10 class. He hired guys that weren't held accountable and quite honestly stunk, some of them on the recruiting trail. Nice guys, but a lot of nice guys finish last. Just the way it is, especially O-line recruiting, the first couple classes. They were bad. So it is what it is. But at the same time, I think this is my guess, and I haven't even asked anybody this. Norvell was told either you're going or you're cleaning house. Those are the two options. Now, if you remember, to Mike Norvell's credit, this is wild, but I give him credit. He took back some of his own money and dumped it into like what they could do. Maybe they suggested it to help make him, help make them think that he wants to be here. I don't know, but he still didn't have to do it technically because he's under contract. So he made the changes, coordinators. He went and got a really good coach from Nebraska who brought some of his own defense assistants. They've done a lot of things differently, but it just wasn't done soon enough in my eyes. Florida State's recruiting efforts, like I'll name like 5 staffs that I can just flat out tell you, they don't get caught with their pants down very often. This is off the top of my head, and there's nothing perfect here, but it starts with the head coach with all of these staffs in one way, shape, or form. They're a little different personalities, but they're elite recruiters too. And that's where Norvell's biggest weakness is. He's a nice guy, but I don't think he grinds the recruiting trail the way they do. Penn State, Notre Dame, Miami. I know you hate hearing that, but Cristobal is an elite recruiter. I think those 3, along with Kirby at Georgia, those would probably be the 4 schools that I feel most comfortable about in terms of how they recruit to their culture. The head coach is directly involved, and they get elite players at the most marquee positions: offensive tackle, pass rusher, D tackle, quarterback, etc. You look at their depth charts at these spots. By the way, most of those schools are the ones that were making noise in the playoff. Coincidence? It's not. It's really hard to lose when you've got the best players at marquee spots. Recruiting is about relationships. Norvell has to get better at. Now, from what I've seen, Norvell has done that over the last few months. Like, he's got a fire under him. And good for him. He should. You're the head coach at Florida State. Life's pretty good. It's one of the best jobs in all of athletics, whether it's the United States or anywhere. It's not hard to get talent to Tallahassee. It's not. Within a 5-hour radius of that campus, my goodness, it's insane. the edge of Atlanta, down to Orlando, Tampa. Don't even count South Florida, like, because you got to go further to get there from, and you're still okay. You're a top 10 program just recruiting a 5-hour radius, South and Central Georgia. Grab a kid from Mobile once in a while. Florida State is a great job. So it irks me that he failed as much as he did, especially when they started winning. Like, they rode the coattails of a couple of weak players. They hit on the portal, obviously, Mr. Travis, et cetera, at quarterback. But they did maximize because they didn't have the right guys on the staff. Let's all hope that Pot Roast and all these guys coming on board will make a difference. I think it will, because, again, I've talked about it several times in the last few weeks on Locked On Seminoles. The official visit list is good. They're competing for the top kids in Florida and Georgia, which, by the way, you're in a good spot. Georgia's number one in the country in players per capita going to the NFL. In the state of Florida, based on last year's draft, had the most kids from a state draft. Doesn't get any better than that. So, and those are the two states they're concentrating on. I think it's pretty wild. All right, Derek Wetherington says, there is no excuse for Florida State to be poor in recruiting. So how does Florida State get better in the trenches? It's just relationships. I know that's a really boring answer, but it's just true. I know fans don't want to hear this, and I say it all the time. Kids do not pick the logo on the shirt. They do not. They pick the person wearing the shirt. You can get mad, you can be an unhappy alum, whatever. That's how this works. It's the same for Notre Dame or Texas or Oklahoma or North Carolina State or Syracuse. It is the person wearing the shirt. Here's an example. Speaking of Syracuse, they're going to do really well in Florida this year. Really well. I put a post on X that Syracuse will get at least 7 guys out of Florida. They got 6 last year. Fran Brown is an elite recruiter because he builds relationships. He wants to be on the phone with people. You can't force guys to do that. I'm still not convinced Norvell wants to be in that boat. Like, I think he would much, much rather be the CEO. Brian Kelly's kind of that way too. Now, Norvell's better at it than Kelly, like personality-wise. That's no contest. Norvell's a much more friendly person to be around. But that being the case, if you're going to recruit and be in a tremendous spot year after year, there's no doubt about it. Florida State is a spot you could have top 5 classes. But the new money coming in, Derek, I tell you what, man, why couldn't Florida State by 28, 29? Because the people know, hey, we're going to be leaving. We might be in the ACC for a year or so, but we're going to be in the Big Ten and the SEC. It's going to be an easier sell year after year for Florida State to jump over that waterway into the promised land. There's greener grass on the other side of the river. It shouldn't be that hard to sell. And if Norvell and his staff, hey, if any part of it doesn't work, there'll be somebody else new here. I guarantee you, especially with that settlement, they got more money to get rid of people. It's not just being held accountable. It's being able to pay for it. I mean, that's just reality. Like anything else, just because you need something doesn't mean you have the financial means to make it happen. Well, Florida State just added a whole bunch of money. And I'm sure that's going to help boosters and everything else too. So it's pretty interesting. All right. One last comment here that I just want to make before wrapping up the show. And that's this. Florida State football is in a much better place, not just because of the ACC settlement, but because some of the changes. And we should all be happy about it because spring ball is going to be more fun now. There's positive things to talk about. Recruiting's going better. We got spring evaluation period in May. You got recruiting visits in May and June. There's some positive momentum and things to talk about heading in to the July period when it gets a little quiet right before the season. But until then, to be honest, plus you got Florida State basketball, get a new coach. There's some positive things just to talk about here on Locked On Seminoles and just in general with conversation. And amen to that. It has been a long ride since the beginning of the 2024 season. Florida State better continue on that path for my sanity. I know that. And I'm guessing that most of you feel the same as well. So with that, thank you once again for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. I truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. Hit that like button, that notification bell, subscribe to the Locked On Seminoles podcast, and share it. I'd love to get in front of more Florida State fans. If you would allow me, please do so. You can follow me at LO_Seminoles on X. Everybody have a good one and take care.